Today, we are on site in New Orleans, Louisiana at ISPOR's annual meeting. We will be recapping some of the top news presented each day at the conference, and soon we'll speak with Dr. Joey Mattingly, Assistant Professor of Pharmacy Practice and Science at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, and Dr. Robert Dubois, Chief Science Officer and Executive Vice President of the National Pharmaceutical Council, about different developments in health economics and outcomes research. Welcome to AJMC On Location. I'm Jamie Rosenberg. The meeting kicked off today with discussions surrounding innovative ways to deliver healthcare and debates over measures of value, beginning with a session that took a deep dive into how innovative technologies will require innovative ways of thinking about healthcare. There was also a session on global developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning in healthcare, which looked at different challenges and opportunities posed by these developments. Finally, a panel weighed the arguments for and against the use of quality-adjusted life years for determining the health effects of medical interventions. Read coverage and watch additional interviews from the meeting at ajmc.com. Here with me now is Dr. Joey Mattingly. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, absolutely.
So, as we see more of these novel and high-cost therapies, such as gene therapies, enter the market, is it becoming harder to determine if these prices are aligned with their value? What are the biggest challenges in trying to do this?
Yeah, so calculating the value may not necessarily be the hardest part. It's the fact that I don't think we can agree on what goes into that equation, and we're not always in alignment as what benefits should count. So is it just the therapeutic benefit, like for a blood pressure medication to lower the blood pressure? Is that the only benefit that we count, or do we count the fact that once your blood pressure is stable, maybe you don't have to go to the doctor as frequently, and is the time that you go to the doctor's office, is that worth something? So can we agree or disagree, or how do we get agreement on which benefits to count?
Right, and there are also challenges with these one-time curative therapies that we don't necessarily have data on their long-term effects on kind of determining that kind of value.
Well, the tough thing is with a therapy that may be curative, right? Maybe as we're leading into a drug like the hepatitis C medications that have become very popular in the press for their high price, but then seeing that, hey, it actually eliminates the virus from the patient. But what does that mean in 20 years? Like if we're going to realize that value? So you're absolutely right that it's a challenge determining what's the value if maybe only a small percentage of the patients would really truly benefit from it if they just hadn't been treated. So, but imagine you being that patient, and you know you have a virus or you have a disease, and there's a therapy that says it can cure you. Wouldn't you want that drug, regardless of whether or not you may or may not have effects 20 years from now? So when you get it from like a patient level perspective, how do we say no? It makes it very challenging for our health system.
Right, and speaking of these hepatitis C drugs, as the healthcare system tries to implement new payment models to try and pay for these high-cost therapies, one that's recently been introduced, for example, in Louisiana, is a subscription or Netflix model.
Right.
How would this model be particularly beneficial in areas with a high prevalence of infectious disease?
Yeah, so, well, one, I have to address the Netflix model comparison. So Netflix doesn't require you to sign up for 5 years. It's not a long-term contract like that. Like if you're not happy with Netflix, you can get out of that contract pretty easily. So there's a little bit clever marketing by the authors, and I actually think they did a phenomenal job marketing that model. But it is a fixed price subscription-based model. I applaud the model for from a public health standpoint, because states were battling just allowing access for these drugs, and they just couldn't figure it out with their budgets, because if all the patients came in at one time, their budget would just be shot, in terms of being able to afford it. And so I applaud those that worked on this model to say, hey, here's a way that a state can figure out, I'm going to pay this amount for 5 years, and then everyone that has that can benefit from it can have access. And so from that, it's an incredible advancement for at least us to discuss more. Now let's talk about higher prevalence diseases. Would this work in hypertension? Would this work in high cholesterol? Would it work in, I guess with infections, we're talking, could it work for HIV because I guess that may be the next big thing we're thinking. What if we cure HIV? Would it be a subscription model that makes the most sense? I think the biggest thing is getting back to what that overall fixed price is. Okay, if the fixed price had been set 5 years ago for a less effective therapy, it may have looked good at the time, but it advanced so much in a 2-3 year period. So what is the fixed price? what's the fixed length of time for the contract? Because is it going to go Netflix? Then that's a 30-day contract, or a short-term contract. If it's going to be a 5-year contract, well, we have a lot of innovation in a 5-year period. So we just have to figure out how do you get out, and how do you get out of the contract, and how costly is that too? Maybe some other questions that I'd love to see what those are, in terms of when the final contract's signed.
Right, and another thing to think about is this might not be beneficial in areas where there's not a high disease prevalence. So is this also indicative, do you think, of a broader theme that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to these kind of payment models?
Oh, that's a great question or comment. I absolutely think there's not a one-size-fits-all. I think it may vary between diseases. It may vary between locations. I think you hit the nail on the head there. In the case of hepatitis C, we've seen several competitors enter the market, and it has allowed for us to really negotiate with individual companies that are making comparative products, right? They may not have come to the table if it had just been one drug and one alternative, right? Why come to the table if you're stuck? So I think it allowed itself a good opportunity to explore. In the case of, whether or not it's that impactful for a particular state, but gosh, I really hope we don't enter a world where people feel like they have to move from state to state just because they have a certain disease. I live in Maryland now, but I've lived in Kentucky and Indiana. I would hate to see such a disparity across what care people get just because of what border what side of the tracks you grew up on. And so I hope that we don't enter into a world where we just have differences based on which state comes up with something. But then again, the beauty of our states, it allows us to experiment a little bit. So everyone's watching and waiting, and we saw New Orleans or Louisiana, but now the state of Washington, I believe, is entering the same type of thing. So everybody's watching, and I think the other 48 states are watching, and so I guess maybe it's good from an experimentation standpoint, but like I said, the unintended consequence may be people that live in Texas that now want to move to New Orleans or move to Louisiana so that they can have access to care.
Right. And another model brought forward recently is the administration's proposal for the International Pricing Index. What are the different pros and cons that come with this proposal?
Well, I think some folks may be scared that it's purely talking about like a reference pricing schedule where we're going to say, here are the prices for these drugs. That is what it is, right? And some would maybe argue that that's a good thing, and maybe it's transparent. Some may argue that it's too limiting, and is it going to scare away investment from the field and research if they're worried about reference pricing or price capping or whatnot. So I think it's important. Look, we have a lot of really intelligent people here at our ISPOR conference this week. I think we've got a lot of folks that are trying to work on solving these problems. Reference pricing or using IPI, or whether you use that or we look at, say what the Veterans Affairs, what the government pays for drugs for like one part of the government. There's lots of ways to do that, but it doesn't get over the barrier of, if you have a disease and there are no alternatives or no options, and a new drug comes out that gives you an alternative, you're probably going to be willing to pay anything to get that alternative. You're really going to want that medication, and that demand challenge, or that challenge of where you just don't have options, that's not going to be solved by a reference price. What we want to make sure we do is that we incentivize innovation. We've got to make sure researchers are working to cure diseases. I sure hope a lot more diseases are cured by the time as I get older, maybe experience those diseases. But we have to do so in a way that just when they do get invented, are we actually going to be able to afford to pay for them? So it is a fine balance. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure that a pure reference price is the solution. But I'm glad that it's being debated. I'm absolutely glad that we're talking about it, because the rest of the world has been working along those lines, and I think we can learn from them. Great.
And these are just two models that kind of represent this shift to having to be more creative with these expensive therapies. Are there any other models you're paying attention to, or you think we should be looking out for?
Well, and without thinking about the models or specific, labeled models, I guess it's always good research. So now that I'm in academia, I feel like I want to come up with a Mattingly model. So but that's more for your own, vanity, I guess. But in a way, like a lot of the solutions aren't they're not crazy. Like it's just or not something super wild. Like the math can be relatively easy. We say, hey, we have patients who need a drug. We have a company who's developed and designed a drug that wants to sell it to these patients. Now, the drug company is a profit maximizing company that wants to sell it to their, to maximize profit, and the patients obviously probably would want to pay less. So how do we make it work so that we keep having people innovating and we keep having patients able to get medications? I don't know if it'll be one fixed model. I do think that we need folks that are putting things together like the subscription models, like IPI, bringing alternatives so that we can debate, look at the pros and cons. We have to look at unintended consequences because sometimes we get so excited when a new model comes out, right? I promise you, if I had developed the Mattingly model that's so innovative and I think it's great, I'm going to be biased and want to see it happen without maybe considering, well, what are the harms? And so I just want to make sure we're careful and not swing, because sometimes the media, you'll swing one way or the other, and everyone will get behind an idea without thinking, hey, what could this do in 10 or 20 years? Could this be something that hurts our overall health care? So I guess that may be, I don't know. I gave you like a political answer. I don't think I could really get on one side or the other. So I just want people to be careful.
Yeah. And do you think there are opportunities to look abroad at other countries and see what their approaches are to addressing these high costs?
Absolutely. When I was a pharmacy student, I had a chance to spend some time in Canada, actually just at the British Columbia Ministry of Health. And growing up in a small town in Kentucky, I didn't know anything outside of the United States and was very USA all the way, is like we're the best at everything, is kind of what I'd always heard, I guess, growing up, and spending some time in the Canadian government to seeing just what they did just north of us was phenomenal learning experience for me. And so now, since then, my wife and I have worked in Ecuador. We travel to Europe every year for the ISPOR European World Congress to learn as much as we can, because there are so many other countries that are working hard to develop these things. We're talking about Louisiana doing the subscription model. Australia did it first, so like we should really be thanking the Australians for being forward thinking and working towards that. So the answer is absolutely yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
All right, great.
Next up, we're speaking with Dr. Bobby Dubois. Thanks so much for being here. We're excited to have you.
My pleasure as always.
So a few months ago, you were an author on a study published in HAMC's journal, which found that value-based payment arrangements, sometimes called outcomes-based contracts, may be more prevalent than previously assumed. Why do you think this is, and what benefits are there to publicly disclosing these arrangements?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a study that we did with the Duke-Margolis policy folks and the National Pharmaceutical Council. It was an understanding of how many risk-sharing arrangements are there out there, and are there more out there than the press might suggest if you just read the headlines. So we did a survey of about 20 payers and manufacturers, and we said, okay, this is all confidential information. How many of these outcomes-based contracts do you have? And then how many did you make public? And in round numbers, for every one we've heard about on the news, there's probably another 3 that we haven't heard about. So there's a large number that we haven't heard about. So now the question is, why would an entity want to make it known, and why would an entity not want to make it known? So let me start on the positive side. They might want to make it known because it's good marketing. Everybody is looking to the leaders, and if this health plan like Harvard Pilgrim and this manufacturer like Novartis or Amgen, whoever it might be, has one of these arrangements, they become recognized as a leader, and everybody wants to be seen as a leader. So that's a pretty obvious one as to why you would want to have it out there. Now, why might you not want to have it out there? There's a whole host of reasons, but I'll highlight 2 of them. One is there's some secret sauce to each of these deals, and you don't necessarily want to tell your competitors, like, how did you actually do it? Because we're finding it so complicated, but now you did it, and what did you do? And maybe we don't want to show what we did. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it puts you under a magnifying glass. People will come back to you a year later and say, well, how did your drug do? Did it do as well as it was supposed to? Did you have to give further rebates? And people may not want to be under the microscope, especially at the beginning when these drugs are known from clinical trials, but we don't know how they're going to perform in the real world.
And among value-based agreements that were successful, what were some common characteristics that you observed that they shared?
There's a whole bunch of characteristics that are almost like a perfect storm that all has to line up for this to work. I would say the most difficult is to find a disease where you have very discrete outcomes you can measure. So the very first outcomes deal that was quite widely talked about was a Novartis product for heart failure, Entresto, and the endpoint was pretty clear. Did the patient get hospitalized or not? Because the clinical trials showed that there were fewer hospitalizations, and that's a pretty easy thing to measure. It's discrete in the hospital, not in the hospital. Other outcomes that can be measured are ones that relate to blood tests, routinely done blood tests. So a lot of the drugs that help your cholesterol or help your hemoglobin A1C. These are routinely collected data points. They're in databases, and so you can measure it and see how the patients are doing and if they meet the endpoints or they don't meet the endpoints. It gets much more difficult if you're looking at quality of life illnesses, where you don't routinely have sophisticated questionnaires and symptom assessments that would be routine. So the first is the outcomes. Second point is data collection. You don't want to have to build a whole infrastructure to collect new data. That's very expensive. But if it's administrative claims data that you can measure hospitalizations or routinely collected labs, that's much, much easier. Now, these are on sort of the disease area. Over the last year or two, we've noticed there's another piece of the puzzle that I think is critically important to ensure more likelihood of success. So the manufacturer might say, I totally trust my drug, I think it's going to help your patients, and I'm willing to go at risk. But then all of a sudden, the payer now is in charge of the patients. So I, a manufacturer, would say, well, wait a second, my drug is only going to work if the patients take the drug. And I don't have any control over that. You, the payer, have some control over that. You can encourage the patient to be more adherent or whatever. So what we're now seeing is requirements on the payer behalf to make sure that adherence is at a certain level. And if it doesn't get to that level, then the drug company is not at risk for underperformance, because you can't have a drug work if nobody takes it correctly. So those are some of the elements that kind of determine success. I guess I'll mention a last one that people don't realize. You may start with a large population like diabetes, but by the time you narrow it down to, well, I only want diabetics that are new to the medicine, and I only want diabetics that are within a certain age range, and I only want diabetics that don't have end-stage renal disease, you end up with such a tiny number of people that it may not be worth the effort. And that's one of the other challenges. Is there enough patients that would meet the criteria to be a part of this arrangement?
Right, so one of the challenges you mentioned that stuck out to me is quality of life measures. So are there best practices or things you could do to kind of mitigate these challenges with integrating these into outcomes-based agreements? For example, migraine, a lot of these outcomes are quality of life. Can they go to work? Can they take care of their kids? Are there best practices for integrating these, or would this require an adjustment to how these agreements are made?
Well, you've raised some that are difficult to assess. Now, you could say, for our migraine outcomes contract, we're going to look at emergency room visits. It's a very discrete endpoint. You have it in your claims data. But a lot of people with migraines don't end up at the emergency room. So although that could work, you're going to miss all the people that were just miserable. Very few employers routinely collect productivity data. Now, they may know if you're out and disabled, but people with migraine headaches aren't out for 2 weeks. They're out for a half a day, or they're at work and they're not doing very well. Those are very difficult to measure and monitor. Now, can you be creative and come at this a different way? So multiple sclerosis and the treatments for MS, as an example, is a quality of life issue. Yes, occasionally they'll end up in the hospital, they'll end up deteriorating and requiring a nursing home, and yes, you could measure that. But for the vast majority of folks, whether they're doing well or not, those are very distant and bad endpoints. But you might be able to figure out that the patient is worsening. What might that look like? Well, people who have MS, if they're worsening, might get a shot of steroids to try to get them back to their baseline. And so that's something that is paid for and measurable. So rather than just directly measuring symptoms, you might be able to get at it another way. Now look, in the best of all possible worlds, we would all on our iPhones have apps, and 10 times a day we would assess our symptoms. And in that world, then you would have the data. But we're not in that world yet, and until that's the case, it's hard to ask somebody to collect data like this just to do one of these outcomes relationships.
Right. And what are some of the biggest challenges payers and manufacturers face when trying to implement one of these agreements? Are there structural barriers they face in addition to trying to come up with the different outcomes?
Yeah, in the study, we not only asked the question how many of these outcomes arrangements that are implemented are public versus not, and we found sort of a 3-to-1 ratio. We found that similar ratio of 3-to-1 in the number of deals that came to fruition versus the number of dialogues that happened. So 3/4 of them, crash and burn. And for one reason or another, they can't get to the point of implementation. So what are some of the reasons why they couldn't get there? Everything from the issues I talked about of finding the outcomes, agreeing upon them, figuring out whether we have the data, just negotiating the contract is a big deal. And then people at some point might give up and say, oh my God, this is just too much work for the small number of patients and dollars that it entails. One of the other structural regulatory problems is Medicaid best price. So for those of the listeners who may not understand, Medicaid gets the best price of any commercial deal out there. Now, if you have an outcomes-based contract where you say, well, if the patient doesn't do well, we'll rebate all your money. Well, then your effective price is 0. Or if half the patients don't do well, then your effective price is 50%. Some manufacturers don't want to take that risk that if it's a small population that, statistics are weird, that maybe a whole bunch of patients statistically don't do well. And so not only does that affect how much you might rebate or pay to that one health plan, but then it would percolate through every Medicaid program in the country. And so unless there is a safe harbor where CMS would say, don't worry about Medicaid best price in this circumstance, this is a pilot and just proceed, that's something that needs to be dealt with either at the regulatory level or at the legislative level. And there's lots of discussions about making that happen.
And with more and more high-cost therapies entering the market, do you think that value-based payment arrangements will become more prevalent as payers try to figure out how to pay for these therapies?
I think they will. As I mentioned earlier, some of the problems are the burden of collecting data, the burden of doing the contracting. Some of these new therapies are very expensive, $400,000, $800,000. Some of the new ones might be several $1 million. So it's worth everyone's while to have the infrastructure to do this. So for example, some of the new cell therapies, the CAR T therapies, these patients, these kiddos, if they don't do well, they're going to end up back in the hospital. Or they're going to have case managers that are going to be closely tracking these patients. So we'll know exactly what happens to them. And because there's uncertainty about many of these new therapies, if you're paying $1 million for a treatment and you're paying up front, and 2 years later the patient relapses, well, that's not a good situation. So it's in everybody's best interest to be able to monitor how well the folks are doing and to pay over time. And that again requires the infrastructure, but with many of these new diseases, it's a lot easier to measure. The new drug, gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, these kids do very poorly without treatment and they die fairly quickly and they're in the hospital. So again, endpoints you can follow, a strong reason for wanting to have an outcomes contract so we can make those amazing therapies available to patients.
Great. And can these arrangements be beneficial for one-time curative therapies, like you mentioned, CAR T-cell therapies, which come with a big price tag and health benefits that accrue over time? Is there a challenge with knowing the health benefits over time because there's not as much data on their long-term value?
Yes, so the issue of the possibly curative therapies is the word possibly. So we don't have long-term outcome data. We have wonderful near-term data that shows these folks are doing really, really well. But maybe they'll relapse in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years. So the types of relationships that are now being discussed have a multi-year component to them. Now, that sounds great. So instead of paying us $1 million up front, you'll pay us $150,000 a year over 6 or 7 years. And then if the patient is no longer doing well at year 3, then you stop payments. One of the challenges, of course, is that patients and their families move health plans. Today you're in United, then you're in Aetna. Medicaid patients are in Medicaid, then they'll get into a commercial plan, then they'll be back in Medicaid. Patients eventually get older and they end up in Medicare. So the group that's paying the bill for this wonderful curative therapy isn't necessarily the insurance company that's taking care of the patients 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. So how do you balance the fact that one insurance company is paying the bill and another insurance company later on might be reaping the economic benefits? So one of the designs now is to have an annuity payment, again, as I mentioned, over 5 years or 10 years, and then some way of saying, you've switched health plans, I will continue to pay those bills on your behalf because I'm taking care of you. Now, you can envision a health plan saying, well, it's not my problem. The other insurance company, they signed this deal. The New Digs program at MIT has built a collaboration in Massachusetts where all the payers in Massachusetts have said, we buy into this. So if they move from their plan to my plan, I will pick up those payments. There's a lot more in the fine print, but that's a way to get around the fact that patients move from plan to plan. Now, if you had Medicare for all, which I'm not in favor of, again, you would have a single payer and you wouldn't have this problem. But somehow or other, we need to have a way so that if patients move from plan to plan to plan, we have that financial responsibility dealt with. It could be done through legislative means to require those ongoing payments. You could envision a reinsurance structure. So you have a reinsurer that sits above all the insurance companies, that each of those insurance companies pay to the reinsurer, and then if patients move from plan to plan to plan, the reinsurer is responsible for all of it. There are a series of solutions, but they all require a fair bit of effort to make them happen.
Right. And other solutions to paying for these therapies are based on the notion that payments for therapy should be paid out over time.
Yes.
And like you mentioned, what are different challenges with implementing solutions like this?
Yeah, it's how are we going to make certain that as patients move from plan to plan to plan, that the responsibility financially is shared. I think when folks originally envisioned these types of risk-sharing deals, they thought of an upfront payment. Well, an upfront payment doesn't allow you to take into account the drug may not work over time. They also don't help the fact that the plan where the patient ends up in a couple years later is now financially free, whereas somebody upfront paid the bill. So we have to somehow figure out how to have more level payments over time, and then the infrastructure to make sure that all payers will participate in that so it's fair to everyone.
Great, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That's all for today. Stay tuned for tomorrow's HMC On Location, where we will sit down with Dr. Julia Slecko, and Assistant Professor of Pharmaceutical Health Services Research at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, about incorporating patient voice into value-based decision-making, and Dr. Michael Sherman, the Chief Medical Officer of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, about ISPOR's value-based price assessments. Thank you for watching HMC News Network. I'm Jamie Rosenberg.